he mori ora, ina iwi, ina mana, ina reo, iwi katoa, tēnā tātou. Kia ora. George Laking, my name, and big thanks to the NZRDA and especially Dr. Curtis Walker for inviting me up here today. When I looked at the program, I saw that there was a day devoted to people standing up and talking about clinical governance with me at the end. So I thought, well, keep them awake, let's try and see if I can wring some controversy out of it. So see what you think. Here we go. What I want to say, just to frame this, is that I believe that we're all here in this room right now because we are strongly committed to quality in healthcare. And so, all the words of wisdom that I've heard so far, to me, they all come back to this basic theme of quality in healthcare. And my understanding of clinical governance is that it actually sits within quality in healthcare. It's a particular package of tools and a particular approach to doing this. So I thought because of our devotion to quality in healthcare, it would be reasonable to take a critical look at clinical governance. I've taken this look from the point of view of Māori health, but I'd like to suggest that the comments that I have are of general applicability. Turn on my timer. Good. Clinical governance reached our shores with the confidence of a globalising movement to improve the quality of healthcare. What does it have to offer Aotearoa New Zealand? In this presentation, I develop 5 criticisms of clinical governance's fitness for purpose. They fall under the headings of trust, equity, failures, whānau and power. For our international guests, the word whānau is the word for family in Māori, but it's got a wider meaning. It's the family sort of in its widest sense. Bindings of kinship and loyalty. The criticisms that I have warn that clinical governance as currently formulated, I'm just going to front foot it for this speech. You can make what you think of it afterwards, but this is the first time I presented this material, so I'm going to front foot it and see me afterwards if you have a disagreement. These criticisms warn that clinical governance as currently formulated is not able to achieve necessary transformative change in health outcomes for Māori or indeed any disempowered person. And I suggest that kaua whakaruruhau or cultural safety as developed by Iri Hapati Ramsden would be a preferred basis to conceptualise healthcare quality in post-colonial New Zealand. So clinical governance, where's it from? It has many antecedents. What way? That way? Pray? No, relax. Could you advance the slide, please? Oh, good. And you'll be able to continue advancing it when I say advance? Good, thanks. So many antecedents. A notable one, interestingly, being the mysterious death at sea in 1991 of British media proprietor Robert Maxwell. It transpired Maxwell had stolen £440 million from the Daily Mirror's pension fund. The UK independent regulator then set up a committee chaired by Adrian Cadbury, next slide, to evaluate the financial aspects of corporate governance. And its findings were published in the Cadbury report. And he was in charge of the chocolate company, in case you're wondering. The report set out a code for corporate financial practice, including separation of governance from operations and use of audit committees. It asserted that had a code such as ours been in existence in the past, we believe that a number of the recent examples of unexpected company failures and cases of fraud would have received attention earlier. Next, please. The need for quality in the UK National Health Service was acutely apparent in 1997 in light of the British Heart scandal. The report of the British Heart Inquiry found that from 1991 to 95, mortality for children under the age of 1 after open heart surgery at Bristol was roughly double that of the other UK centres, exceeding 30% in absolute terms. there was one series of operations where I believe 9 out of 13 infants died. It was the idea, next slide please, of the newly elected UK Labour government to adapt the Cadbury approach to the NHS in the 1997 white paper called The New NHS, Modern, Dependable. This paper marked the first appearance of the term clinical governance. The classic definition by Scally and Donaldson in the BMJ from 1998 is that clinical governance is a system through which health organisations are accountable for continuously improving the quality of their services and safeguarding high standards of care by creating an environment in which excellence in clinical care will flourish. We've seen that already on the screen today. Degeling and colleagues wrote on the clinician's role in clinical governance and pulled out 3 points of focus. The first thing they said was that clinical governance must address the aims of care. So are we doing the right things? And it framed these aims of care as value for money in light of health needs and resource constraints. And the second aim was conduct of care. Are we doing things right? That referred to national codes of practice, systematisation of care and key indicators performance. And then the third aim was, are we keeping up with new things? And what are we doing to extend our capacity? And that looked at service and professional development, mentoring, leadership, staff appraisal and review. So you can see these are recognisable elements of a quality system in any industry and made specific to the healthcare industry. Next slide. In New Zealand, the Best Practice Advisory Advocacy Centre published a guide to clinical governance for New Zealand primary healthcare organisations in 2005. This includes, it's identified 6 elements of clinical effectiveness. Joe's recited them this afternoon. Quality improvement, clinical effectiveness, quality improvement, provider development, clinical audit, risk management and research. A 7th element of clinical governance called patient involvement did not survive the journey from the United Kingdom to the New Zealand BPAC. However, BPAC identified 3 principles of clinical governance, which we've also seen today: clinician centrality in decision making, holistic scope of decisions and transparency. And what BPAC has said is that the only way to make clinical governance succeed is if these principles are adhered to. So clinician centrality, holistic scope and transparency. Now, BPAC reference what they claim to be empirical evidence to support the idea that that's the only way clinical governance can be made to succeed, but I couldn't actually find it in the empirical evidence in the work that they cited. So I think there's a good deal of faith that those elements ought to succeed. But how warranted is it? Next slide, please. In New Zealand, clinician centrality was taken up by the 2009 Good Hands report of the Ministerial Task Group on Clinical Leadership. I believe we have at least one author in the room. That report identified New Zealand triggers for review of quality in publicly funded health systems. Things like the Gisborne Cervical Screening Inquiry, reports of the Health and Disability Commissioner, studies reporting unintended harm to hospitalised patients, all triggers for reviewing approach to quality. In Good Hands positioned clinical governance as the vehicle to create distributed leadership at service delivery, hospital and national levels with clinicians at the centre. This would re-empower clinicians and achieve shared responsibility and accountability with corporate management for both clinical and financial performances. In 2012, the Ministry of Health commissioned Otago University's Centre for Health Systems to survey professionals in DHBs. Many of the respondents said yes, they were in partnership with management, and the DHB supported their leadership in the quality and safety of care and gave them responsibility for decisions. However, many doctors did not feel engaged. Gould has said that the path to developing clinical governance is not straightforward, especially Gould being one of the authors of the Otago University report, especially where systems have been run by managers, are underdeveloped, professionals are overwhelmed with clinical duties, or lack fundamental managerial skills. I think echoing themes that have come up today. It is notable that clinical governance is still not part of the official vocabulary of the New Zealand Ministry of Health, as far as I can divine, apart from the National Ambulance Sector Office, which talks of clinical leadership and governance for ambulance officers. Next slide, please. Te Ao Māori, the Māori world, puts a focus on whakapapa, the sequential history of people, things and ideas. So what I've just laid out is some of the whakapapa of clinical governance. But there's a wider context, and that's got to begin, if you roll it right back, with the history of medicine itself. And so I want to recite this whakapapa in order to break some of the hypnotic power exerted by the UK National Health Service on health discourse in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So apart from the former colonial power, New Zealand is the home of its own cultures. Māori are here with centuries of settled experience and arrived with the traditions of Polynesia before that. Pākehā New Zealand is a distinct society that fuses local and European values, and it's not simply a European clone. Later immigrant communities have shaped national values and conversations. It's hard to work out exactly when medical activity by humans began. The most tangible candidate seems to be cranial trepanning, dating to 6,500 BC in Western Europe. A strong contender for the first state-sponsored healthcare system was the Rashidun Caliphate in 7th century Islam. This reified ideas of welfare as forms of zakat, or charity, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. From the 9th century, the Caliphate was funding hospitals. Next slide. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, before European contact, until the Tohunga Suppression Act of 1907, Māori tohunga were guardians of the technical knowledge of healing. The name Uenuku, divinity of the rainbow, is associated with healing by the whakatauki or proverb, haere whae te waiwai o Uenuku, kaura ai te tangata, which means go to the feet of Uenuku that the people may be well. That mountain there is Tapuai or Uenuku, the feet of Uenuku. It's on the Kaikoura range on the eastern side of the South Island of New Zealand, for those who are not resident in New Zealand. In this country, one of the aims of Te Tiriti of Waitangi in 1840 was to preserve the health of Māori. The British resident James Busby wrote of the miserable condition of the natives that promised to leave the country destitute of a single Aboriginal inhabitant. Article 2 of Te Tiriti in the Māori vision guarantees Māori all their taonga. Although the British translated taonga as properties, the word's meaning in Māori goes beyond the material to things of incorporeal value such as language and health. And Article 3 imparts to Māori the rights and privileges of British subjects. The first modern state welfare program in the world was established in Imperial Germany. The Sickness Insurance Bill of 1883 formed a health service for industrial labourers. Employers contributed 1/3 of costs, workers contributed 2/3. With the passage of the Social Security Act in 1938, New Zealand is said to have adopted the Western world's first full social security system, including free access to public hospitals. The United Kingdom did not replicate this until a decade later, when the NHS Act was passed and came into force in 1946. So, although New Zealand is the smaller national health service, it is indeed the senior. The ties between New Zealand and the UK have continued, with sharing of people and ideas across our health systems. Both systems have been subject to crises and reforms. When there's a crisis in the UK, the learnings and responses naturally propagate across to New Zealand. Although there's a lot for us to learn, not all imports from the United Kingdom have been an unmitigated success. We should appraise such things critically. The first point to make in a Māori critique of clinical governance is that Māori are very much in need of quality in health. For Māori, expressions of this need are found in the ongoing consequences of colonisation. Colonisation has exchanged land and language for participation in an institutionally racist society. The social and economic determinants of health are systematically more adverse for Māori, and the system to remedy this is harder to access. The starkest result has been a refractory 7-year difference in life expectancy. It's notable that the In Good Hands report identified its triggers as the Gisborne Cervical Screening Inquiry, reports of the Health and Disability Commissioner, and studies on unintended harm to hospitalised patients. None of those things, and none of the UK scandals, have led to a 7-year difference in life expectancy for 15% of the population. So just underscoring the Māori need for quality and health. Next slide, please. So I've got these 5 criticisms. I've got to say the first one is kind of technical, but it was the only one I could find in the international literature. Perhaps other people are aware of others. This came from Davies and Mannion, health economists from the University of York, and they wrote a paper on striking a balance between checking and trusting in quality assurance. And their critique is that clinical governance, which was the focus of their paper, clinical governance was, the way it was implemented at that time in Britain, was rather heavy on the checking and audit side, and not so much on the trusting people to do their job side. So these authors have applied economic principal agent theory, and that looks how a principal, who's someone in charge, tries to overcome the opportunism of the agent, who's someone that does something for them. In this case, the healthcare organisation is the principal and the clinician is the agent. Opportunism by agents happens if they make undesirable trade-offs between multiple competing objectives, or worse, they may exploit their powerful position to maximise their own gain. So principal-agent theory understands this type of scenario. Davies and Mannion identify compulsion and trust as 2 ways the principal can counter opportunism. On the one hand, save my slides please. On the one hand, you can compel the clinician to reduce asymmetries of information by releasing their performance data, or on the other hand, you can create trust by creating a shared quality culture. The thing about compelling people to do stuff is it's expensive to enforce, and the thing about trust is it's expensive to create. And the question is, what's the right ratio of compulsion and trusting? This man here, Bill Uchi, shed light on that ratio, because he compared in these types of situations the ability to measure performance, so the achievement, what people did, versus what he called the congruence of the principals and agents' goals, i.e. if the principal and agent were trying to achieve the same end. Later versions replaced congruence of goals with knowledge of the process, which I found quite helpful. So there's 2 things to consider in striking a balance between compulsion and trust. One is if anyone can actually say, well, these are the things you have to do to get the job done, that's knowledge of the process. And the other thing is if anyone can say, oh well, that job's definitely had a good outcome, that's knowledge of the outputs, the outcomes. You might think it's strange. How could we not know that someone's done a good job? Well, in health, you sometimes only find out 10 years later that they've done a good job. So that's an example. So Uchi said that if you don't know what you're doing, but you know what the outcome is, then you should have a market and with competitive tendering. And he said, but if you know exactly what you're doing and exactly what the outcome is, then what you need is a bureaucracy. No, you can have a market or a bureaucracy if you know both things. Yeah, but if you know exactly what you're doing but you can't tell what the outcome is going to be, that's when you definitely need a bureaucracy, because a bureaucracy can keep track of each item of thing that has to be done in the job. And I think pre-flight checks is possibly a good example of that type of scenario. The special case is when you can't actually describe the things you do to achieve the desired end, and it's hard to measure what happened. And the term that he used there was plan control, and that's described as a reliance you fall back on a reliance on shared values and beliefs and an expectation of reciprocity or trust. And it's been argued in the context of New Zealand health reforms that plan control is better for clinical practice because diagnosis and treatment are so uncertain. In contrast, bureaucratic control is better suited to administrative and support departments. Clean control is not without risk, however. For example, the creation of cliques or old boys networks. Anyhow, Davies and Marion suggest that clinical governance has been transferred from a more bureaucratic corporate setting into settings of clinical care. And what they concluded was that healthcare needs to strike a delicate balance between attempts at control and fostering of high trust relationships in a quality culture. So this criticism of clinical governance could be remediable, provided someone can figure out how to strike the right balance. Next slide, please. I felt that was a fairly technical criticism, but it had to be said. The meatier ones are yet to come. The second criticism is failures. So clinical governance has been empirically assessed in relation to at least two other events in the NHS. These are the medical mass murder at Shipman and the scandal at the Mid-Staffordshire NHS Trust. We should question clinical governance's ability to prevent such failures. Now, of course, clinical governance is not in itself to blame for Shipman, because almost all of his crimes were committed long before his arrest on September the 7th, 1998. But in the fifth report of the Shipman inquiry, Dame Janet Smith concludes that clinical governance would not have been capable of detecting Shipman's activities. She thought the only way you could do that would be by analysing mortality statistics. Actually, Guthrie and colleagues have since argued that it's almost impossible to figure it out by mortality statistics as well, because even if you set a flag at a threshold of 10 excess deaths per annum, you still only got sensitivity of 50% for mass murderers, and you've got a false positive rate of 15%. Bit of a worry. The most that Dame Janet Smith and the Shipman report could say was the chance of detection would have been quite high if there had been clinical governance plus stronger controls on death certification and controlled drugs, which have subsequently happened. The Mid-Staffordshire scandal happened after clinical governance had been in place for a decade. So it doesn't get off the hook quite so easily. Patients were left in squalid conditions by a hospital that lost the capacity to care. The official inquiry found that the national general acceptance of the importance of clinical governance had failed to permeate sufficiently into Stafford to result in a functioning, effective system by 2009. In summary, the official response to both these events was to class them as sui generis, one of a kind, and exonerate clinical governance. I think that's a shame. Clinical governance will be less likely to permit the repetition of such failures if we could actually take ownership and learn from them. Next slide, please. The third criticism, equity. That's a romantic heart valve, which is kind of the benchmark for equity in healthcare, I feel, in this country. To remedy the difference in health outcomes for Māori requires an urgent equity intervention. But the core texts of clinical governance make no mention of equity across communities and society. They refer at most to generic health need. In New Zealand, the BPAC guide refers to care based on an holistic analysis of individual needs rather than the effectiveness of any single intervention. BPAC says this may be of particular importance for PHOs with a significant percentage of Māori or Pacific peoples. But it leaves it up to the reader to guess why that might be important. The language is all in terms of the individual patient rather than systemic disparities afflicting identifiable groups in the population. In the absence of an explicit informed focus on equity, it is unlikely that such analysis will address health inequities. It may be that this criticism can be offset by reworking the language in core documents on clinical governance, and there's evidence of such developments in Scotland, for example, where their clinical and care governance framework seeks to create an organisational culture that promotes human rights and social justice. Good on the Scots. A simple and effective operational remedy would be to universalise equity reporting within clinical governance, i.e. you break down your reporting and your audits by ethnicity and socio-economic status. Next slide. Fourth criticism, whānau. Whānau, that's family in its wider sense of kinship and loyalty, has a central place in the Māori worldview. This is, in fact, 4 and 5 are really the big ones, I just want to say. So whānau is the first of the 2 big ones. This is a component of the whare tapawhā model of Māori health, alongside the physical, psychological and spiritual. Family health is an intrinsic element of health, one of the major conceptualisations of health within the Māori world. It's the basis of whānau ora. That's a recent major reform to the New Zealand health system. There is a deep underpinning intuition that changes in the well-being of individual Māori can be brought about by focusing on the collective of whānau and vice versa. Yet, clinical governance is disengaged from whānau. The resurgence in Māori attention to whānau coincides with trends over the last 40 years under economic neoliberalism towards an atomisation of Western society. In the medical sphere, this has been apparent with a move away from ethical paternalism towards a preeminence of individual autonomy. That in turn reflected disenchantment and breakdown in trust of the medical profession in the context of the same sentinel events that led to clinical governance. People sought autonomy rather than paternalism. What you must understand is that the breakdown of trust for Māori towards the health system is often even worse than that. When trust is lower, whānau may be sceptical of appeals to informed participation by patients. Freedom of choice, you have to understand, is illusory if the doctor-patient relationship contrives to steer the individual towards a preset conclusion. For this reason, whānau may feel greater security engaging as a cohesive group with health providers. Nothing in this precludes a person from deciding to step apart from their whānau, of course, and engage with their healthcare provider in their own right. However, what I want to put forward is the idea that particularly for Māori, the value of whānau is extremely strong. There's a more positive reason for patients to involve whānau in their care, and that's the distributed network of resources they provide. Different whānau members have different roles, including sharing technical knowledge, providing logistic support, providing emotional and spiritual support, deliberative counsel, registering of memories for future years, communication and storytelling. For these reasons, plus general solidarity, it's easy to see how 6 or more whānau members might join the designated patient in healthcare settings. And another positive reason for whānau to be involved is that they also suffer and they legitimately seek sakua and healing from the health system. From a Māori perspective, healthcare providers have a responsibility of care towards whānau, not just the designated patient. This is an ethical insight that seems alien to Western medicine much of the time, with its elevation of patient-centred care. Of course, whānau also put their designated patient at the centre, but the patient is not just a core to be cut out of the apple and returned for processing. Reading the reports of the Bristol, Shipman and Sheffield inquiries of the Māori Eye, one keeps asking, where were the families? Even by Western standards, one would have expected family involvement in the Bristol tragedy because it was a paediatric setting. That report notes, there does not appear to have been any deep thinking about how to communicate information to parents in advance of surgery, nor any systematised approach to doing so. The sense is gained that informing parents and gaining their consent to treatment was regarded as something of a chore by the surgeons. But weirdly, the Bristol report talks positively of family-centred care, but nowhere does the term family-centred care actually appear in its recommendations. The Shipman inquiry makes multiple references to departments of family medicine, but evidence of agency of actual families is minimal. There are several hundred individual case reports. They're typically bracketed by, at the start, families trustingly delivering their loved one to Dr. Shipman, and at the end, their contact by the inquiry some years after the death. Shipman's crimes were facilitated by the privacy and sanctity of the doctor-patient relationship. The one concession towards families in the Mid-Staffordshire report is they should be exempted from having to register to provide physical care to patients who are dependent in a hospital or care home setting. So families shouldn't have to register to provide care to someone in their family. I think it's ironic that clinical governance had its genesis in the Bristol tragedy, but there does not seem to have been any deep thinking about the pivotal role of families in understanding and monitoring quality of care. These three tragedies could have been less virulent if only whānau were properly recognised and involved in care. Clinical governance could achieve this if it broadened its vision from mere patient centrality to properly encompass whānau. Next slide, please. The fifth and final criticism really ties the room together. It's a film quote, sorry. It unifies and explains the first four. It's that clinical governance has got too little to say about interpersonal power. And this is notable, given that change in culture is tied to change in power, and appeals to culture change pervade the writing on clinical governance. Scally and Donaldson call for positive organisational cultures. The Bristol Heart Report seeks a new culture within the NHS, a three-way partnership of respect, honesty and openness. Degeling agrees that clinical governance is by far the most high-profile vehicle for securing culture change in the new NHS. Gould and Horsburgh note that many CEOs have worked hard to turn around cultures of disengagement with systems for governance and leadership. There's wide agreement that the success of clinical governance's objectives is connected with organisational culture. But these writings say little about how such cultural change is to be achieved, apart from wishing for it. It's probably been a bit harsh, actually, since I wrote it, because sitting here in the room today, hearing what people have had to say, with the wisdom that's been expressed about quality in healthcare, I sense that that's how a culture talks to itself and shifts in a particular direction. But the plea I'm making here is for a power analysis. So, for example, the balance, and I'm just going through the other four criticisms one by one, the balance between control and trust in cultures of quality depends on the relative power of the bureaucracy versus the clan. To increase trust in expert clinicians requires the managerial group to relinquish some of their power. The official characterisation of the Shipman and Mid-Staffordshire tragedies as sui generis, one of a kind, does not speak critically to UK state power. Dame Janet Smith says it would be asking too much of clinical governance to expect it to catch a Shipman. That's a depressing conclusion, given that clinical governance seems to be the NHS's main vehicle for quality. The Mid-Staffordshire report suggests clinical governance could have prevented the tragedy if only it had been properly implemented. This is a classic transfer of responsibility onto the less powerful agent, in this case the NHS Trust, rather than the UK state, and it's victim blaming. In relation to equity, to properly address equity requires a transfer of political power from dominant to marginalised groups. Even to report equity endpoints in audit requires a transfer of such power. This is knowledge that is routinely and systematically concealed by the system in the absence of equity reporting. There is profound transformative power in revelation of differences in performance by ethnicity and socio-economic status. For example, I can't remember the exact figure, 25-fold extra chance of having bronchiectasis for Māori or Pacific children compared to New Zealand European children. That's an example of equity reporting. To properly engage whānau in patient care, moving on to whānau, requires a transfer of power from health professionals to whānau. Eddie Harpati Ramsden addressed this topic in her writings on cultural safety. Here's what she said. I quote from her. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs. The systems and culture called nursing taught me about inflexibility, conformity, control and oppression, and fear of change. Those were significant lessons. They made me think critically about power, how it was managed, and who the beneficiaries of power and control really were. This led to further formal education and enabled me to recognise and analyse personal and institutional racism, as well as the ambivalence of social and cultural boundaries and the issues they represent for nursing. Examining myself as a culture bearer, I was astonished at the level of racism and victim-blaming attitudes I carried with me as part of the social class in which I've been raised. I was grateful for the education, which enabled me to understand the origins of these attitudes, and for the insight, which helped me to think them through and do something about them. I had no guilt about their presence because I understood them as social constructs, but I knew they had to go if I was going to be effective as a nurse. End of quote. The key phrase is, I knew they had to go if I was going to be effective. You cannot be clinically effective. You cannot until you are ready to transfer the power of the healthcare system to whānau. To be an effective clinician, you cannot just be a wielder of power. You have to be a vehicle for the transfer of power. Ramsden related this transfer of power to the Māori concept of mokai, the giving of skilled and valued service that makes life easier for others. Mokai does not mean servitude. A mokai is a valued professional, community member with skills to improve the life of individuals in the collective. Mokai are not just nurses and doctors, they're everyone involved in the activity of caring. Occupational therapists, social workers, cooks, orderlies, clerical staff, all people without whom the well-being of the patients would be directly affected. Mokai is a role with mana, or standing, I suppose, that offers a means. It offers a means to be a vehicle for the transfer of power. Notions of the transfer of power are evident in much of the writing on clinical governance, especially in this country. It's a shame that they're almost all appeals for a transfer from management to clinicians. For example, BPAC seeks clinician centrality in decision making. The In Good Hands report explicitly seeks to re-empower clinicians and put them at the centre. Later writings by my union, my new union, the Association of Salaried Medical Specialists, talk of patient-centred care, but do not identify the relevance of a transfer of power nor address the role of whānau. A major barrier to change of culture in colonised societies is institutional racism. I suppose I have to provide a definition of this because it's such a thorny subject. It's a different thing from personal racism. One way I thought of it was a mollusk that stops being poisonous but instead grows a poisonous shell. So the mollusk is completely harmless and non-poisonous, but its shell's quite toxic. The shell being the structures of the society that we inhabit, the mollusk being ourselves, who are, good, nice people. Can't argue with that. Anyhow, the Puʻao Te Atatu report in 1986, the Break of Day report, described institutional racism as the outcomes of monocultural institutions which simply ignore and freeze out the cultures of those who do not belong to the majority. National structures are evolved which are rooted in the values, systems and viewpoints of one culture only. Participation by minorities is conditional on their subjugating their own values and systems to those of the system of the power culture. Clinical governance calls for cultural change in healthcare until it engages properly with power as exercised by individuals, clans and cultures in society. Its efforts to change culture will be, alas, futile. Next slide, thanks. That's a picture of Eri Hapati Ramsden, who was, I think, intellectually, in the intellectual sphere for New Zealand. She's up there with Sir Edmund Hillary, having invented cultural safety being a movement in quality and health of global significance. Obviously, this is the point that I wanted to get across today. She's no longer with us, alas. So, Again, I want to say, what I've been saying, this is not a criticism of quality in healthcare or wisdom about quality that we've heard today, or of the tools and expertise that are bundled up inside clinical governance. But my focus is on the utility of clinical governance as an overarching approach. It's not possible for clinical governance to be all things to all people all the time. It is possible that clinical governance could be improved to strike a better balance between control and trust, to criticise its own failings, to take heed of equity, to acknowledge and empower whānau. The trouble is that clinical governance as now formulated cannot achieve necessary transformative change in health outcomes, not only for Māori but for any disempowered person in this country or anywhere in the world. Indeed, the uncritical adoption of clinical governance by the health system risks further entrenching of institutional racism. Fortunately, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we already have a program that is thoroughly fit for the purpose of quality in a post-colonial society. In Māori, it's called kawa whakaruruhau, the protective protocols. In the English language, that's cultural safety. As a concept, it's 9 years the senior to clinical governance. It was first voiced at the Hui Wai Manawa in the South Island in 1988. It has got interpersonal power relationships at its very core. Irihāpiti Ranston's PhD thesis is available online. It's essential reading for anyone who's interested in transformative change in health. Cultural safety comfortably houses the elements of clinical governance. It comfortably houses all those things we value: clinical effectiveness, quality improvement, provider development, clinical audit. She was very strong on that. Risk management and research. It strongly acknowledges and builds on the missing seventh element of patient involvement, extending it to whānau. Culturally safe care is said to have 4 dimensions: a transfer of power from the provider to the recipient of care, an attitude change in the provider. It's the recipient who determines if the care is safe, and development of skill and knowledge to challenge and change harmful institutional practices. These are the types, and I'm reaching the end now, these are the types of cultural change New Zealand, and I'll be as bold as to say the United Kingdom also, having seen the tragedies there, need to function in a post-colonial era. We can be grateful to the NHS, the Junior Health Service, for prioritising quality improvement in health. We can be grateful to corporate bureaucracy for lending us some tools and a theory of management. We can be grateful to all the proponents of quality in healthcare and quality in general for the expertise and wisdom they've developed. We can be especially grateful to Irihāpiti Ranston for giving us an overarching approach that is fit for purpose. So I encourage everyone involved in healthcare quality in this country to work under the mantle of kawa whakaruruhau. Could I have the last slide, please? Kawa whakaruruhau. That's the Greater Magellanic Cloud, which you have to be in the Southern Hemisphere to see. It's a satellite cluster orbiting the Milky Way galaxy, and its name in Māori is Te Whakaruruhau. So, always nice when the thing you want to talk about has got a astronomical object named after it. So I really encourage everyone to get behind that. Te he mori ora. Kia ora.
Thank you, George. Lots to challenge us with there. George, medical counsel is trying to move the profession on from informed consent to informed choice. Is that part of empowering whānau?
So,
by that I mean we give the patient and their family the right information for them to make a choice about their health care.
yeah, well, I think the idea is that when we envisage these clinical scenarios, the family are there with the person. You know, it gets kind of tricky if you sort of think, oh, what are we doing? Are we forcing this person to be with their family in that situation? My experience, at least in oncology, is that it's extremely unusual to meet anyone who's completely alone in this world. And when times get rough, people want someone to be along with them, and they bring those people with them, and those people make the effort to support, you know, the person who's suffering. And we must respect the effort that the commitment that people's family and supporters make to come along and help them through that journey. And I think it can only work to the strength if that wider group is involved in thinking about these momentous decisions. Now, I think this is where some of our clinical skills come into play, because sometimes it's not the right set of people. Sometimes it's like a nominated family, or I say I'm the family but I'm not really, and you can kind of get a sense for that in the clinic. But I think that's part of our clinical skills, to really be able to perceive how families operate. But I say bring them into the room.
Questions or comments on the floor? Nigel?
I'll shout. I'm Angela from Southern. In a relationship with patients, one of the most important outcomes is often the medical record. And it seems to me, I'm just saying, one of the most important outcomes of clinical care, after the clinical care and all that, is actually the medical record, which it seems to me there's a strong objection from the medical profession to sharing this with patients and pharma. You know, we now have the technology, it can be done, but I experience on a daily basis objections to what seems to me the most simple thing. And what's your view of that?
Well, I think that's extremely odd. But I think the Health and Disability Commissioner shares that view. I guess I did a good deal of training in the United Kingdom. Somewhere along the way I picked up the idea that a person's data belongs to them, you know. This information about my healthcare belongs to me, thank you very much. And it's down to me to say who I share it with. And I just feel for anyone in any walk of life, not only medicine, I think there's a strong principle that whatever you say, you should be ready to say that to the person that's being talked about.
Yes.
Kia ora, I'm Jessica. I'm one of the surgical registrars at Dunedin Hospital. Thank you very much for your talk. I just wanted to discuss a little bit more the point that you raised about you felt that further reporting of ethnicity and socio-economic data you felt would be helpful. And I guess I've just seen quite a lot of examples where it possibly is the opposite. You know, I've been to a lot of surgical conferences where registrars are reporting a finding that they found, and often are treating the ethnicity data without real respect. And I think in those circumstances, often what it does is reinforce stereotypes that individuals and health systems have towards Māori, towards Pacific Islanders. And I think what that can serve to do is that sometimes you create attitudes within even clinicians, because a lot of the data is being produced by non-Māori organisations or researchers. And I just wanted your thoughts on reporting this data with respect so change occurs, rather than just reinforcing stereotypes, you know, just putting numbers out there to be numbers, you know.
Yeah, thanks. I might have, it seemed to me you might have been describing a different scenario from the one I was thinking of, which was at the population level rather than the individual case level. My comments were really about how we audit outcomes and processes and health states across populations rather than identifiable individuals. But I think that there's a further point in there that this becomes an incredibly sensitive topic, and with potential for major abuses when these findings they can be taken away and they can be framed in an extremely destructive and unfair way. And the phrase that's popped into my mind about that is Indigenous data sovereignty. So I think what it must start with is a primary understanding that where a particular community is identifiable in an audit or statistical form, that in fact that information belongs primarily to that community to start with. My own commitment and faith, I suppose, is that we will still reach a far better place if we lay these things out in the open rather than sweeping them under the carpet. But I think your point's very well made. It can get quite dangerous.
I think one of the reasons Council is so constantly talking about cultural competence for these very issues, it's not a PC tick box feel good exercise. It's about being able to actually understand what your data means, and no one should be standing up at a conference and just spouting a bit of rubbish without being able to actually discuss what the data means. But I'd agree with George that we're not going to solve health inequity without social services, housing, education, justice, et al., all knowing what's going on. And I think it's too easy to just give a snapshot that all Maoris are in prison and no Polynesians take their pills. So we have to somehow it's how the message is packaged, I totally agree, but it's a real challenge. And, no one's got the right answer. In fact, the rest of the world's looking at us. Curtis and I were in Melbourne last week, and Curtis spoke on a similar topic. And it had the audience, which was relatively small but spellbound. It contained the chair of the GMC, the chair of the General Medical Council of Great Britain, the chair of the Medical Board of Australia, and the head of the Independent Professional Standards Authority for the UK, all in the room, all asking questions, because everyone's grappling with this. It's not just about Indigenous health needs, it's about every disadvantaged society. So take Syrian refugees arriving in Germany. It's a real challenge, and how it's presented is crucial, and who's presenting it needs to know what they're doing, why they're doing it, and be prepared to defend it.
I still believe it is a universal, and I think the moment something goes wrong in health, that person joins the ranks of the disadvantaged in some way. So I believe very strongly that the ideas that Peter Harpity-Ramsden has developed are for everyone in the room. And I have to admit, I feel incredibly proud that those ideas have come out of this land, that we all inhabit.
Hi, it's Alistair. Just a question on that. Do you think that reporting ethnicity data, when it's received in an environment that still has institutional racism, could part of the solution be to move away from ethnicity data, as ethnicity is not a modifiable factor, and then focus on the underlying modifiable determinants of health that we can change?
Well, I guess it doesn't really compute for me. But it's precisely because ethnicity isn't modifiable, and yet it is the index for so much disadvantage and injustice. So I have to admit that idea doesn't really compute. I do feel that another one of the terms, my colleagues in public health are more adept and accustomed to talking about these things than myself, but they talk about strengths-based analysis rather than deficit-based analysis. So certainly we want to look for strengths-based analysis that offer ways out of ghastly situations rather than simply describing ghastly situations.
think I'd agree with George. I think if we didn't look at these rather unpalatable statistics with an ethnicity background, Daisafati's work in Wellington would show that everyone got chemotherapy. It wouldn't tell us that Maori women with curable lung cancer got palliative chemotherapy far more commonly than Europeans with treatable lung cancer stage for stage. It wouldn't generate the debate that we still haven't had about national bowel cancer screening and why on earth we're not introducing it earlier for Maori men at least. I'm not sure about Maori women, Maori men at least, because they get the disease 10 years younger than us. So, I think we do have to be aware that there are problems out there. Now, Daisafati's work, and if anyone hasn't seen it, just YouTube it. It takes about half an hour to watch. She doesn't reach a conclusion as to why. She just says that these are the facts. And I think if we need to challenge the profession that there are some things that we can probably change. Why do Maori people with cancer, why are they less likely to see George and more likely to see his registrar historically? That's the oncology data. We don't know why, but we should challenge that. The group that's grabbed this, orthopaedics.